It was never supposed to come out. Not this letter. Not at this time. For years, there had been things said behind closed doors that were never meant to leave the walls of the houses they were spoken in. But on this particular morning, something changed. A single piece of paper made its way into the hands of someone who wasn't meant to have it. And the moment Prince William read the first few lines, he knew nothing was going to be the same again. He wasn't sitting in some grand room when he found out. He was at home, in a quiet moment, before the day had properly started. The kind of moment he very rarely gets. And in that moment, something landed in front of him that revealed a choice had been made a long time ago. A choice that had quietly been affecting people he cared about for years. It wasn't explosive in the way people might expect. It was quiet. Personal. And that was exactly what made it so difficult to ignore. Because once you read something that was never meant for you, you can't unread it. And from that point on, there was only one question that wouldn't leave him alone. How much longer could he leave this as it was? That's where this story begins. Not with a statement. Not with a press release. But with a letter that forced one man to make a decision he had been trying to avoid for a very long time. Now, most people only ever see Prince William in public. They see the walk behind the car. They see the handshake. They see him at a hospital, or at a football match, or walking beside his wife and children. But very few people ever see the moments in between. The moments where he's not the future king, but a brother, a son, a husband, and a father. And it was in one of those private moments that this all started to unravel. Here's where everything changed. It wasn't a big stack of documents. It was just one letter. But it had been kept away for a reason. When William first read it, he wasn't looking for a problem. He was just trying to understand something that had never quite made sense to him over the last few years. Little things that had added up over time. Conversations that had stopped halfway through. Replies that never came. Plans that fell apart with no explanation. But as he read line by line, the pieces started to slot together in a way they never had before. It wasn't anger that hit him first. It was a kind of sadness. Because this wasn't a recent falling out. This went back further than most people realized. And for the first time, he could see how a series of small decisions, over a long period of time, had slowly built into something much bigger than any one argument. But what happened next surprised everyone. William didn't act straight away. He could have. He could have picked up the phone in that moment. But he didn't. He read it again. And then a third time. He knew that once he acted on what was in front of him, there would be no going back. So for a few days, he carried it around with him in private. He'd think about it in the car between engagements. He'd think about it late at night, when the house was quiet and the children were asleep. He kept coming back to the same thing. This wasn't just about two people anymore. It was starting to affect things that went far beyond them. Things that affected people who hadn't chosen any of this. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized he couldn't keep holding it in the space between hoping it would fix itself and knowing it wasn't going to. That's not even the biggest surprise. Because the letter itself only revealed part of it. What really shifted things for William was realizing how many decisions had already been made off the back of it. Quiet decisions. Ones that hadn't been announced. Ones that had slowly changed expectations over time without anyone ever explaining why. He started to notice patterns. Things that had been moved. Things that had been withdrawn. Things that had been left uncertain on purpose. None of it looked dramatic on its own. But together, it told a very different story to the one the public had been shown. And for someone who was going to one day carry a very heavy responsibility, he couldn't ignore the question of what was being protected, and who was paying the price for it. Then something unexpected happened. William reached out to one person he knew he could speak to completely honestly. Not to ask them what to announce, but to ask them what was fair. He didn't want to react out of hurt. He didn't want to act out of frustration. He wanted to be sure that if he did anything, it would be for the right reasons and not just the painful ones. They spoke for a long time. No cameras. No notes taken outside the room. Just two people talking through all of it. And by the end of that conversation, William wasn't just hurt by what had happened. He was concerned about what it meant going forward. Because once trust starts to erode in a family that also has public duties, it doesn't just stay personal. It starts to spill into things that affect a lot of other people. But here's the part almost nobody knows. This wasn't the first time there had been a serious fracture. It was just the first time something written had made it impossible to leave it unresolved. To understand why it got to this point, you have to go back a little. Not decades for the sake of it, but to a time when two brothers were growing up side by side in a very unusual world. They shared the same grief at an age no child should have to. They walked behind the same coffin. For a moment in time, the whole world saw two young boys walking together. And for a long time after that, they only really had each other in certain parts of their lives that nobody else could understand. But as they got older, their lives started to pull in very different directions. One was gradually moving toward a life that had been mapped out since before he was born. The other was trying to find space to be something different. Neither of those things were wrong on their own. But the space between those two paths got wider and wider. And over the years, the gap that started as difference slowly turned into distance. And distance, left for long enough, turned into something else entirely. And this is where the story becomes even more dramatic. Because with that distance came decisions. Some were public. A lot weren't. Roles started to change. Expectations started to change. And with every year that passed, the practical reality of who could do what, and where, became more complicated. William had been slowly stepping into more responsibility for a long time. Not all at once, but gradually. It wasn't something he rushed. It was something that built around him as life moved on. With that came things that needed to be held steady. Things that couldn't be left in limbo every time tensions rose. He'd learnt very early on that some things can't wait until everyone feels ready. Sometimes they have to be held, consistently, even on the days when it's hard. So why did the prince really make this decision? It came down to a point where the private conflict was starting to make it impossible to keep certain things stable anymore. The letter had confirmed something he had been trying to hope wasn't the case. It showed a clear intention about certain roles going forward. And once that was there in writing, William had to ask himself a question he couldn't avoid any longer. Could the current arrangement continue without causing more damage to things that needed to be protected for the future? He didn't make the decision in anger. He made it after a long period of trying to keep things together. He made it after conversations that didn't lead anywhere. He made it after realizing that keeping something the same was starting to cost more than changing it would. And the part that weighed on him the most was that it would hurt people either way. Here's where everything changed. William started speaking to a very small number of people about what needed to happen. Not to discuss headlines, but to work through the practical side of it. Because stripping royal titles isn't just a sentence said out loud. There are things that have to be considered. There are connections that exist. There are charities, there are links to places, there are histories attached to those titles that don't just disappear overnight. He wanted to make sure that whatever was done, it was done properly. Not rushed in a moment of emotion, but carried out in a way that reflected the weight of it. He spent time going through it piece by piece. What would change? What wouldn't? What needed to be communicated privately before anything was ever said publicly? And through all of that, the thing he kept coming back to was responsibility. Not power. Responsibility. But what happened next surprised everyone. News didn't leak for a while. For a short window of time, it stayed between a very small circle. During that time, William was still carrying out his normal engagements. Still dropping his children off where he could. Still sitting in meetings. Still visiting places he'd committed to. Very few people around him could tell anything had shifted. But inside, that decision was already made. And he knew the moment it became public, everything would change again. He also knew it would be interpreted in 100 different ways within the first hour. And there was nothing he could do to control all of that. All he could do was be clear about why it had reached that point. That's not even the biggest surprise. Because whilst all of this was happening privately, there was another detail from the letter that had been sitting with him. It wasn't the main point. But it explained a lot of the timing. It revealed that certain things had been held back in the hope they wouldn't come to this. But once lines had been crossed, those things couldn't be held back anymore. That realization changed the timeline for him. It meant waiting any longer wasn't actually keeping the peace. It was just prolonging something that was already broken. And that was a difficult thing to accept after years of trying to leave doors open. Then something unexpected happened. There was one final private attempt made. Not to undo the decision, but to see if there was any way to lessen the hurt without undoing the reason it had to happen. It was honest. It was difficult. And it didn't change the outcome. But it did confirm to William that the decision he'd made was the one that had to stand. He didn't walk away from that conversation relieved. He walked away with a heavy weight that stayed with him for a long time after. But here's the part almost nobody knows. A lot of people assume this was about one moment. It wasn't. It was about a build-up of years. If you look back over the last few years, there were moments where things could have gone a different way. Small moments where a phone call could have repaired something. But each time, the gap got a little harder to cross. William had always tried to keep a door ajar. Even when it was difficult. Even when he was the only one trying to for a while. But there comes a point where keeping a door open stops being kind to anyone, if people are never going to walk back through it in a way that rebuilds trust. And that point had quietly arrived sometime before the letter ever came to him. And this is where the story becomes even more dramatic. Once the practical steps had been put in place, the decision had to be communicated in the right way. Privately first. William felt very strongly about that. The people affected were told before anything reached the public. Not hours before. Not at the same time. But with enough time for it to be heard directly, rather than read on a screen. That wasn't easy for anyone involved. But it was important to him. He didn't want it to be a surprise in the worst way possible. He wanted it to be direct. Human. And as hard as those conversations were, he knew he owed that much. So why did the king really make this decision? Because William wasn't trying to punish anyone. He was trying to protect something. Not just an institution, but the people within it who show up every day and do the work. The people who never ask for headlines. The people who keep going through difficult times. He was also thinking about the future. About the example that would be set. About whether things could remain steady years down the line. And most of all, he was thinking about his own children. Not in a way of shutting doors, but in a way of trying to build as much stability around them as he could, whilst knowing the life they're growing up in will never be simple. Here's where everything changed. When it became public, it moved faster than anyone could keep up with. Within minutes, opinions were everywhere. Some people understood straight away. Others didn't. A lot of people only saw the action, not any of what led to it. And that's always the case when something private becomes public overnight. William had prepared himself for a lot of it. But there were still moments that caught him off guard. Messages from people he hadn't spoken to in years. Kind words from complete strangers. And also things that were very hurtful. He didn't read all of it. He couldn't. But he knew it was coming. But what happened next surprised everyone. In the days that followed, William didn't try to argue his case publicly. He didn't release anything. He didn't point to the letter. He didn't explain line by line. He just continued with his work. He went to the engagements he had already committed to. He spoke to the people in front of him. He held his children. He went home at the end of the day. That wasn't a strategy. That was just how he chose to carry it. Because he didn't believe the answer to a private family decision needed to be fought out in public every day. Some things are heavy enough without adding more to them. That's not even the biggest surprise. Over time, a few things became clearer to people who were watching closely. The change didn't come with anger. It came with restraint. It didn't come with a long statement. It came with a quiet adjustment. And that quietness said more than any statement could have. It showed that this hadn't been done on impulse. It had been done with a great deal of reluctance. And that reluctance is something that very few people ever saw. Then something unexpected happened. Months passed. Not everything healed. It didn't suddenly go back to how it was. But some of the pressure that had been there for so long started to lift in small ways. Not between the people directly involved in the way people might hope for, but in the day-to-day around him. William noticed he could focus on things he hadn't been able to fully focus on for a while. Little things. And after carrying something for such a long time, those little bits of space felt bigger than they actually were. But here's the part almost nobody knows. The hardest part for William wasn't the decision day. It wasn't the public reaction. The hardest part was the quiet days after. The days where there was no announcement to make anymore. No meetings about it. Just normal life, but with something missing that used to be there. He never expected to not feel some kind of grief after it. Even though he knew it was necessary, there was still a loss to it. You can know something is right and still miss what could have been at the same time. And he carried both of those things quietly. And this is where the story becomes even more dramatic. Because this decision didn't just affect the people directly involved. It rippled out. It changed expectations going forward. It set a boundary that hadn't been there before. And boundaries, once they're in place, changed the shape of things for a long time after. But it also gave something else. Clarity. For the first time in a long time, there was a level of certainty where there hadn't been any. And for someone who will one day have to hold a lot for a lot of people, that clarity, as painful as it was to get to, mattered. So why did the prince really make this decision? He made it because he couldn't keep asking other people to absorb the uncertainty anymore. He made it because trust matters. He made it because duty doesn't disappear when it's inconvenient. And he made it because sometimes looking after the future means making a very difficult decision in the present, even when every part of you wishes you didn't have to. Here's where everything changed. William still thinks about it. He probably always will. Not every day like he did at the start, but at certain times. When a certain date comes around. When something happens that would have once included both sides. In those moments, it comes back for a little while. But he doesn't try to push it away anymore. He just sits with it for a moment, then carries on with the day. But what happened next surprised everyone. The people closest to him saw a change over the following year. Not a hardening. A steadiness. After years of something unresolved sitting in the background, there was a different kind of calm. He could be more present. And for William, being present with his family is something he protects more than most people realize. That's not even the biggest surprise. Looking back, the letter was the thing that brought it to a head. But the decision had been growing for years. It wasn't built in one day. It was built in hundreds of small days where things didn't get repaired. And sometimes, the thing that looks sudden from the outside has actually been the most considered thing on the inside. Then something unexpected happened. There was no grand reunion. No dramatic moment that fixed it all. But with time, the temperature changed slightly. Not back to before, but different to the height of it. And William left space for that, without expecting it to erase anything. He learnt to hold the hope for civility without holding the expectation that everything would return. But here's the part almost nobody knows. He still regrets the pain of it. He doesn't regret the boundary. But he deeply regrets that it ever had to reach that point. That sits with him more than anything else. Because for all of the public side of it, at its core it was still a family matter. And family matters have a different kind of weight when the world isn't watching. And this is where the story becomes even more dramatic. Years from now, people will probably remember the moment it happened. But very few will remember the weeks of quiet before it. The nights. The conversations. The times he tried to find another way. The times he chose not to say something in public even when it would have been easier in the moment to defend himself. All of that happened away from cameras. So why did the prince really make this decision? Because some responsibilities can't be passed on to anyone else. And when you're the person who will one day hold things for others, there are moments where you can't just avoid something because it's personal. You have to face it. And facing it doesn't always look kind in the moment, even when the intention behind it was to protect stability for a lot of people over a very long time. Here's where everything changed. Now, life has moved on. The day-to-day is full again. School runs. Meetings. Visits. The kind of ordinary things that, for William, are never actually ordinary. But they're the things he values the most. And in amongst all of those things, that decision is now part of his story. Not the whole story. Just a chapter in it. But what happened next surprised everyone. He hasn't closed every door forever. But he's made it clear which doors need certain things to be rebuilt before they can be opened again. And he's left that without bitterness. Just with a quiet truth. That rebuilding would take more than time. It would take action. And until then, things will remain as they are. That's not even the biggest surprise. The most human part of all of this is that none of it was black and white. There was a lot of grey. There were good memories mixed in with the hard ones. There was love there for a long time. And William hasn't tried to erase any of that. He still remembers the parts that were real. He just couldn't keep them carrying the weight of everything that came after. Then something unexpected happened. As time has gone on, younger people who have watched from afar have started to see it differently. Not just the headline, but the cost of it. The cost to the person who had to make it. And sometimes, the people who hold boundaries are the ones who carry the most quiet hurt whilst everyone else is looking at the boundary itself. But here's the part almost nobody knows. William never wanted this to be his story. He never set out to do it. He spent years trying to avoid it. But when the choice came down to avoiding it or protecting something that needed protecting, he chose the latter. And he's still living with the weight of that choice, quietly, every single week. And this is where the story becomes even more dramatic. There are still things that only a handful of people will ever know. The full contents of that letter will likely never be made public. And maybe that's right. Not everything that happens behind closed doors needs to be pulled out into the open to be understood. But what can be understood is the impact. And the impact was big enough that a very reluctant decision was made. So why did the prince really make this decision? Because sometimes love looks like trying to fix things for years. And sometimes, when that isn't possible, love looks like stopping things from getting worse. William tried the first one for a very long time. Eventually, he had to do the second. And now, here we are. Most people will move on to the next thing tomorrow. But for the people involved, this isn't something that just ended when the news cycle moved on. It still exists in quiet moments. It still exists in birthdays. It still exists in places that hold memories. William doesn't speak about it. He hasn't given the full story. And he probably never will. But every now and then, in a moment when the cameras are far away, he'll think back to that morning with the letter in front of him. The morning where he sat in a bit of peace before his day started, and in a matter of minutes, knew his life was going to shift again. He made the decision he had to make. He carries what came with it. And he still leaves a little bit of space, quietly, without demanding anything in return. He doesn't know if that space will ever be used. He can't control that. But he hasn't locked it shut. And maybe that's the most human part of the whole thing to leave with. Not a full ending. But a door that isn't slammed. Just closed for now. And whether it ever opens again, isn't up to him alone.